Welcome to the 2019 Needham Healthcare Conference. I'd like to introduce Renee Aguiar-Lucander from Calliditas Therapeutics.
Well, thank you. In the meanwhile, at least, thank you very much for coming today. It's great to be here at Needham. And what I want to introduce you to today is Calliditas Therapeutics. And as you know, there are forward-looking statements, so there's a disclaimer. You've seen them in plenty of other presentations today, so I won't go into that in any detail. Just a brief summary of Calliditas. We are a specialty pharma company based in Stockholm, Sweden. We listed on NASDAQ in Sweden in late June 2018, and our ticker is CalTax. We raised about $82 million at that time, and at the end of 2018, our cash position was $72 million. We are running a phase 3 that's ongoing with a readout expected in the second half of 2020, and our lead indication is IgA nephropathy, and we also have a couple of pipeline indications focused on orphan liver diseases, more specifically AIH and PBC, which I will also cover a little bit later. So our lead candidate, really Nefecon, is focused on the treatment of IgA nephropathy, which is a chronic autoimmune disease of the kidney. But despite the fact that actually it affects the kidney, it actually doesn't start in the kidney, but rather in the gut, where we have the vast majority of our autoimmune system, and more specifically in the distal part of the small intestine, where we have the Peyer's patches. And I'll talk a little bit about how we actually get our medication down to that part of the gut. We are the only company globally that's had a successful phase 2b study where we met both primary and secondary endpoints. It was in 150 patients in 10 countries and 62 sites. And what we're doing now, we're in the midst of a phase 3 trial that is more or less a replica of our phase 2b. And with as I said, with a targeted readout, top-line results in second half 2020. There is nothing approved in IgA nephropathy today, and there is a significant unmet medical need. We're estimating the market opportunity in the U.S. Only to be $1 billion or more. So IgA nephropathy, as I said, is a chronic autoimmune disease of the kidney. There is a genetic predisposition which is required but not sufficient. So in order to trigger the disease, there is a necessity for environmental, bacterial, or dietary trigger. This disease not only presents in the kind of 20s and 30s. This is when a lot of people are diagnosed. It is more prevalent in men than in women, particularly in the Western world. It's a variable disease, and it can take 10 and even 20 years in order for the patient to actually end up with end-stage renal disease. And we know that up to 50% of those patients which are diagnosed do progress and end up at risk of ESRD within this time period. It is a large orphan indication. The company, we did our own prevalence study in Europe, and that resulted in about 200,000 patients as an estimate. There are no kind of intra-Caucasian kind of differences known. So actually in the U.S., it's estimated to be about 130 to 150,000 patients. It is far more prevalent in Asia, and where we know that there are significant differences between Caucasians and Asians with this particular disease. In terms of the pathophysiology of the disease, so let's talk a little bit about the origin and progression. So the predominant theory, as I said, is really that this starts in the gut, where the Peyer's patches are located, which are concentrated in the ileum. And these Peyer's patches actually generate these IgA antibodies that are deficient. They are underglycosylated, so there's a lack of sugars in the hinge region, which makes them immunogenic. And these are secretory IgA antibodies, and therefore if they were to remain in the lumen, there probably wouldn't be that much of an issue, but we do know that these antibodies actually find themselves out in the blood in these particular patients. And as they do so, it causes an immune response We actually have autoantibodies created, and therefore these large antibody complexes circulate and ultimately deposit in the glomeruli of the kidney, where they cause an inflammatory response, and therefore also ultimately will then lead to fibrosis and necrosis. But because we have about 1 million of these glomeruli in each kidney, as I mentioned before, it can take up to 10 or 20 years before patients end up with risk of dialysis or transplantation. So how do we actually deliver our drug several meters into the intestine? So Nefecon is a unique two-part formulation. So actually there's a capsule which remains intact as it passes through the stomach and most of the small intestine, and actually with a pH trigger actually then releases a cascade of triple-coated beads, both with the active substance budesonide as well as a variety of polymers, which result in a unique kind of dissolution curve. And so budesonide is something that I'm sure you're familiar with. It's something actually that's been used to treat other kind of mucosal diseases such as asthma. And in this case, we're delivering it really kind of to treat the mucosa of the gut. And once the budesonide has had its action in the gut locally where it actually needs to be at a fairly high potent dose, it goes straight to the liver where it actually is metabolized by 90%. So budesonide is part of the class called corticosteroids, but has kind of a very, very different kind of profile to something like prednisone or prednisolone, which typically people might think about as steroids, but those are systemic, while budesonide is much more of a local treatment. And what we're trying to do here really is to treat the mucosa locally and do so with a fairly potent dose, and then combine that with a very kind of benign safety profile due to the fact that the bioavailability of budesonide is so poor, which is exactly what we want. So there's only about a 10% bioavailability of budesonide. So as I mentioned before, we're the only ones that have a successful phase 2b trial in this indication. It was a large study population, 150 patients, 10 countries, 62 sites in Europe. It was a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled trial. And what we saw is that we had 3 arms. We had placebo, we had 8 milligrams and 16 milligrams. And in the 16 milligram dose versus placebo, we saw a reduction of proteinuria of approximately 30%. We also saw, very importantly, a stabilization of eGFR. So actually the measure for kidney function was stabilized in the kind of treatment arms, while the placebo group continued to see deterioration of the kidney function. We also saw, and actually this was a trial where we had a solicited actual kind of safety questions. So everyone had to ask at every visit, had to answer basically 14 questions. But despite that, we basically saw no reported adverse events at all in the higher dose group for 60% of the patients. And actually there were none of the kind of concerning issues that you would potentially look for in this kind of corticosteroid class. So there was nothing on the metabolic side. We didn't really have any weight gain. We didn't have any change in new diabetes or change in blood pressure or other things that would be concerning. So the adverse events were mainly, they were mild to moderate, and they were typically kind of cosmetic and transitory. So we're now in the middle of phase 3 trial. So this is, to all intents and purposes, really a replica of the phase 2b. So patients come in on optimized Raflicade, so they do have kind of blood pressure lowering agents at the highest kind of recommended or tolerable dose. And this is because this has become very much a standard of care. As I said, there's nothing approved in this indication, but this comes from the logic of knowing that you have proteinuria, i.e. you know that you are leaking protein over a membrane. So to reduce that pressure obviously logically makes sense. So after that, they are randomized 1-on-1 to 16 milligrams of Nefecon or a placebo. And they then are treated once a day orally for 9 months, after which we read out efficacy and safety. So this is a global trial, 19 countries, up to 150 clinical sites. It has exactly the same design and endpoints as the phase 2b, so the endpoint is still reduction in proteinuria. Secondary endpoint is stabilization of eGFR in the safety and efficacy trial. And there are 200 patients required for us to recruit and randomize and treat prior to filing for a market approval. And as I said, top-line readout is estimated as second half 2020. We will continue to recruit patients into this trial, up to 450 patients. And the reason why we do this is because there is a requirement to validate the surrogate marker, and in this case, obviously, the surrogate marker is proteinuria. And in order to validate that, we will continue to recruit patients, and after treatment, they will go over into an observational study where we will simply just follow the eGFR of these patients over time. And so first patient was randomized in November 2018. And so far, we're happy to say that the trial is progressing well and that we're on schedule for the readout as we have announced. In terms of the actual problem that we're dealing with, and this is something that you're all going to be very familiar with, in terms of the cost of transplantation or the cost of dialysis, it is very substantial, and it continues to grow. And these patients actually are a little bit different than maybe your typical dialysis patient, because we know that over 50% of these patients will go into dialysis before they've even turned 50. And there are no kind of specific concomitant comorbidities. And so these patients can be very healthy actually by the time that they do have to go into dialysis and be really in the middle of their life. And so this is something also where they can stay on dialysis for a relatively long time. And we also know that for those patients that have this disease that get transplantation, because it doesn't actually start in the kidney, there is a significant rate of reoccurrence in those patients with regards to this particular disease. We have all rights to this product globally, and our plan really is to commercialize in the U.S. ourselves and then to partner ex-U.S. We've done a lot of feasibility studies globally, both in the U.S. and elsewhere. And in the U.S., we found that there's certainly quite a lot of hub and spoke structures. So from dialysis-oriented nephrologists, there'll be a certain kind of like a re-referral to other kind of nephrologists who specialize in some of these therapeutic areas. And so we think that we can have a very, very manageable sales force and effectively target the nephrologists that are relevant for this particular patient population. It's also something where we know that nephrologists and physicians are keen to try and find something and use something on their patients which they can start early, which they can retreat patients with. We know that this is an autoimmune disease. We have not been successful to treat or to kind of solve autoimmune diseases yet. So there is a kind of a part of this treatment that will be assumed to be kind of intermittent or chronic over time. And with this fact that we know exactly how this substance performs and what the issues are and what the benefits are, we feel very good about the fact that we have something that has a good efficacy and a good safety profile and is relevant for the physicians for what they're looking for in this particular patient population. In terms of the product protection, product exclusivity, as I mentioned, this is an orphan disease. So in terms of the protection, there will be 7 years in the U.S. and 10 years in Europe. On top of that, we have a patent which is granted in all kind of relevant areas, which runs until 2029. And also last year, we started building a complementary patent estate, which we're hoping to further build as time goes on to provide additional protection going forward. In terms of some of the other pipeline indications that we have this year in Q1, we got ODD for autoimmune hepatitis. This is, again, it's a chronic autoimmune disease, this time of the liver. And again, this is something where there's nothing that's approved on the market today, and there's a significant unmet medical need. A lot of patients today will have to have as their only option is to be treated chronically with systemic steroids, which again causes significant side effects. And we know that there is a significant amount of refractory patients out there. And having spoken both to patient organizations and to physicians, we think that this is an attractive indication where we could actually really solve a problem for patients who feel as if there really is very little out there for them today, by giving them a local treatment with a benign safety profile, really targeting the liver and not providing these kind of systemic issues which they have to deal with today. In terms of the other, we also got an ODD for primary biliary cholangitis, or PBC, and as I'm sure you know, there's quite a lot of research going on in that area, and also related to NASH. However, there's been quite a lot of kind of maybe unexpected failures in some of that kind of clinical research pipeline. And in terms of looking really at the kind of anti-inflammatory pathway, it's something where we feel that this is something that we could actually kind of target this disease with, again, something that's a well-known active and something where we know kind of what the safety profile most likely will look like. And with this, because we have kind of a well-known active, we believe that we have an opportunity to enter into late-stage clinic in both of these indications. And our plan really is to go and have discussions with the FDA this year. And presently we're in conversations with both physicians and patient organizations to design a clinical program which we think will be the most appropriate to bring forward and discuss with the FDA later this year. So in terms of our pipeline for news, so what we're doing is we've also mentioned that we are going to go back, and we've said this even from the beginning, we're going to go back and have some conversations with EMA this year with regards to the surrogate marker and their view on approvals and what's required in Europe on that basis. We're also going to, as I mentioned, go and see the FDA with regards to the additional pipeline indications. And we also hope to have the trial fully recruited before the end of the year this year. And then with the view to reading out top-line data in second half 2020. And we believe that where we are in terms of the program and our background and the data that we've generated, we feel very good about actually having a high probability of being the first drug to be approved for this particular indication in the U.S. And actually bring some alternatives to all these patients, which today really have very, very few options, and actually address this unmet medical need that's out there. And also with the view to hopefully have a disease-modifying effect on this devastating disease. And so with that, I thank you for your attention. Any questions?